Morning. On behalf of WPC's Adult Ed Committee, it's a true honor to welcome you to today's Faith Conversation, continuation of our fall focus, Blessed are the Peacemakers. We're really privileged to be joined by Dr. Daniel Wehrenfennig, the Executive Director and Founder of the Center for International Experiential Learning. Guided by his Christian background, Daniel's dedication to global education and experiential learning has profoundly impacted many. He comes to us at a pivotal time, just before the 2024 presidential election, with a critical presentation, The Importance of Difficult Conversations. Born in Germany, Daniel's international education journey led him through conflict-affected regions such as the Middle East, Kosovo, and Northern Ireland. Since moving to the U.S. in 2003, he earned his Ph.D. in Political Science International Relations from UC Irvine, where he founded the College Tree Initiative, a renowned experiential learning program. His commitment to fostering understanding and reconciliation is evident in his extensive travel. In the last 15 years, he's traveled to areas like the Middle East, Turkey, Armenia, Georgia, Colombia, and Northern Ireland dozens of times, immersing his students in critical peace-building experiences. Dr. Wehrenfennig's work is deeply rooted in his Christian faith, serving as a foundation for his efforts to bring divides and promote peace. Today's presentation will serve as a catalyst for us, as people of faith, to live out the values of love, peace, and hope in our own varied and fraught contexts. As we gather for today's discussion, let's embrace the spirit of open dialogue and the transformative potential of engaging in difficult conversations, and may Daniel's insights guide us towards greater understanding, compassion, and love for our neighbors. Please join me in extending a very warm welcome to Dr. Daniel Wehrenfennig.
All right, so there's the first difficult conversation is, should I speak with the microphone or can you hear me when I do it without it? Microphone? Okay, all right. I normally have a very loud voice, so just checking in on that. And I like to dance around when I speak, so forgive me about it. So I'll try to do my best. It's great to be here. Normally, I do a lot of international speaking, so it brings me around the world most of the time. So coming, just from the other side of town here is a nice change for that. And I skipped my church this morning to be here, so thanks for having me. So lots of things to speak about, and I have the difficult conversation with you, the difficult task to share some insights about a topic that we should probably talk more and many hours about. So I'll try to just highlight and give some ideas and impression, like as a good pastor does, give some things and help you all continue to work on those, and maybe we can continue the conversation another time. So now also trying to shrink, normally when I do these workshops, it's like 8 to 10 hours, into 45 minutes. Which as a former professor, is not going to happen. But I'll try to do my best. Thank you, Scott, for the introduction. It's a lot of things to share about my background, and normally, I speak in a lot of interfaith and international context. And given my own background, it's been interesting that I came back to speaking in a more secular or more university context. And there's a lot of my work in the interfaith space has been more in the kind of Jewish-Muslim, context, and the UC system, where I was a professor for many years, in terms of like around the Israeli-Palestinian conflict and peace and negotiations and all of that, which is a whole nother topic. And it's interesting to come back more also to the more, kind of Christian spaces to speak about these issues. But today's talk, I think, is very inspired in my own journey, and I'm happy to share more of that and answer many questions. But I think it's a topic that I think is hopefully something that is applicable generally, no matter if people of faith or not, and whatever it means in different contexts. And it's really about something that I think is really, really important for coming, into this next season, not just in the U.S. in general. I think we're living in a world, and that's maybe where I start, that I think is a fair academic, or as somebody speaks, you always should be honest about your own beliefs. So I, look at the world as a place that becomes more and more diverse, and more expressive in the different ways we are. As a former professor, like learning how to use gender pronouns and how to kind of make a commendation to people and making sure we're seeing people for that ethnic, religious, national, different backgrounds. I think it's a very important thing to do, also while challenging in many ways. And we have learned a lot more in the last couple of years to be more aware of the differences we have. We have, at the same time, not done such a good job to look at the world when people are expressing their differences, how to live together, because these differences are always not adding up to be, kind of like addition to each other, but they can sometimes also just be in conflict. And I think as someone who spends a lot of time in conflicts, we also have looked at conflicts in a more something that should not be normal, that we should be afraid of, and that should be avoided. And that's something I want to kind of start off today, doing, kind of a little bit manage their expectations. We only do two things today. We speak a little bit about why difficult conversations are important, what are they, what can we learn, how maybe we think about them, and then I will go deeper into some ideas that I talked with Jake that he felt was most helpful to you all right now about why are some conversations more difficult and what are some ways to maybe reflect on that and see if there's some movement forward, to make them less difficult or to deal with the difficulties about them. But first of all, difficult conversation in my world has been something that I always assumed is something just to be avoided or to be managed. And if we have it, to kind of like you learn the skills how to be a peacemaker, how to do conflict resolution. And the longer I do this work, and I have been doing this work for like 30 years now, the more I come to the conclusion that difficult conversation and how to have them and how to deal with them is not a skill, but this, a muscle. And I tell you a little personal story to that context that maybe some of you can identify with. When I was a professor at UC Irvine after I got my Ph.D. for over a decade, and because I became the conflict guy, I was just put in charge of like a lot of campus climate and all of that activity. And then in 2016, kind of becoming relevant next week, in the election of 2016 and the outcome of that, we had a massive crisis on campus. Meaning we have a lot of students that after the outcome of the 2016 election were facing the reality of going home for Thanksgiving to meet their families and to meet their extended families, and felt like this was not just a different outcome of an election and what they felt and believed, but they felt that the people and how they voted in their extended family, and I not want to be political, it's just explaining the challenges, was not just an expression of a different opinion, but kind of a judgment on themselves and their lifestyle and their friends and their reality. And for the first time, we had hundreds, actually thousands of students who were challenging or questioning if they even should go home for Thanksgiving. And had major trepidations about engaging on that issue. And so me, the conflict guy, was just, Daniel, why don't you go and fix this? So I had many conversations with hundreds of students in the weeks after the election leading up to Thanksgiving about what to expect and what to do. And there's a lot of conversation that was, I think, helpful to many, and there's obviously an ongoing conversation there. But what happens to me is, besides me being the conflict person, I have a Ph.D. in this, I spend a lot of time in conflict in my world, thanks mentioning some of that, in the Middle East, I'm German, I was early on in my life in something that's called third generation dialogue, third generation German, Israeli-Jewish conversation about the Holocaust, the Shoah, what it means to grow up on the side of the perpetrators, the victims, what that means. I spent some time in the Kosovo during the conflict, working with groups affected by that. I spent a lot of time, I was in the US Congress when 9/11 happens and the outcome of that. It's a lot of things. So conflict has been what I do. Wrote a PhD about Northern Ireland and the Middle East, all of that. And so I'm in this situation, spending a lot of time with the students on campus, and I get burned out. I get burned out and felt like it's too much to deal with all of those challenges and all of that. And then I sat with myself saying, if I'm the conflict guy, probably the most educated person, one of the most educated persons in universities, the most equipped person, is burning out on conversation with students about going home for Thanksgiving because of an election result. What's going on here? And it brought me to the muscle. Because I spent a lot of time in administration at the university, but actually did not have difficult conversation myself. The more and more in my friendship groups, in my world, I was just surrounding myself with people who think like I am, who were agreeing with me, and I did not do the active work to leaning into the differences and meeting people and being surrounded by people who had different thoughts and ideas than around me. And it just became clear to me that we have to rethink this whole idea about being ready for difficult conversation, and also just to think it more in the sense of a workout routine. If you go to the gym, it's a good idea to be fit. You may have been fit in your life at some point. We may have muscle memory, we know how to do it. But if you don't do it, if you not more often have difficult conversation, it becomes very hard. It becomes unusual, it becomes something we're running away from, and it's something that we're not prepared to have more regularly. So it made me to rethink, and that's a whole nother conversation, but you can look up my name, and I did a TED talk about that, one of these TEDx things about how to train your muscle for difficult conversation in that. But the reality is, and I think that's the reality not just for my students or for people I deal with, this is how we deal with conflicts. When somebody, a lot of conflicts these days are happening on social media or difficulties or expression, and if we surround ourselves or spending time with people that we don't like or they express things we don't agree with, we just cut them out, unfriend them. I think in YouTube, unfollow them, or whatever it is the new social media it is. But it would be interesting, and you could just put it to the young generation and their social media use. But here's a statistic for you that blew me away when I heard about it. And maybe that's the reality here, and I could raise your hand, but just think about it. But based on statistics, 2/3 of all Americans or Europeans or Western folks, within the last 5 years, have cut off relationship to a dear person in their life, family member or close friend, based on differences that they're facing with. Mostly political, but can be otherwise. And when I go in my talks and I have people raise their hand, that's probably what I see, that most people can name or think about somebody in their life that they're not talking to with anymore, that they have stopped communicating with or engaging with based on the differences they're facing, because it's too difficult, too hard, all of that. So it's not just a social media phenomenon, it's not just student on campus, it's all of us that are faced, and it's me, I'm not just even like the intellectually, there are people, unfortunately, in my family that, extended family, that have cut off relationship with myself based on the differences we have. And so it's a real challenge. We're living in, a society that becomes more expressively different, and which is beautiful. We have a lot of challenges to do. We all need to be on board, and we stop talking to each other and isolating and polarizing around these different things. But this, would be a sad morning if I only talk about the negative part of things. So I also want to reframe things. And it took me about 20 years into my own work and research to hear about this. And maybe you have heard about it. If not, it's something fascinating. Everybody knows about PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, the negative outcome of conflict or differences, and how it really is a hardship that is increasing that a lot of people deal with in life. But again, another similar statistics, actually still 2/3 of our conflict and differences, if you see conflict big C and small c, just challenges we have in our life, end up actually in post-traumatic growth, meaning we're overcoming those, we're dealing with that, we're evolving by being challenged by it. So I've been married for over 20 years, just had a young daughter. But when people ask me, Daniel, what's the secret to your marriage? I'm not pointing to the material wealth I have. I'm not going to point to the great vacations I have with my wife. I will tell many stories of how we have survived and overcome challenges in our marriage. That, I think, is true for a lot of us. When you think about your friendship or why you're close to some people, it's the history you share of hardship and you dealt with and you overcome. That's the first and the only time I will mention this other word, COVID. Terrible time. But I think when we look back in another 5 or 10 years, the way how we have evolved as a society, the medical research, the response, and what also came out of responding to COVID, the reflection on our life, on values and lifestyle, there's, I think, a lot of growth that we can find in relationship or in response to a very difficult and terrible time. And most invention you can imagine, or most things that happened, did not come because people just had great idea. They were responding or dealing with deep crisis and came up to be ways to, to be entrepreneurial, to change and all of that. So what I'm trying to say is dealing with conflict is not just a necessity of an increasingly polarizing and diverse world, it's also opportunity of growth, and it's actually an opportunity also of a better life. So there's you can look it up, there's like two really smart psychologists, and I have to always read their names, not to butcher them anyways. Tedeschi and Calhoun, and they're kind of in the mid-90s, and they identified, which might be interesting to everyone here and should be interesting to everybody here, 5 places that PTG, post-traumatic growth, shows up and what that means. After a crisis, let's say there's a growth in personal strength, closer relationships, greater appreciation for life, new possibilities, and here comes the interesting one, spiritual development. A lot of people, if they respond and deal with crisis, I think also have spiritual development. There's an interesting kind of statistics been done, especially in the US after the Vietnam War. How many people coming back from the Vietnam War that really have helped and changed and thought through their way of relating to their faith and their spirituality as a response to a big time crisis and war? A lot of kind of research we know about that. So all of this to say is, I think as people of faith, besides, we're called to be peacemakers, which I take very seriously, and it's a very important part of my life. I think it's also a place, I think, in the world for spiritual growth, for a place that I think people are looking and are needing to find us as a community that can be, on the forefront of some of that, and I think the Christian faith and the way we live it out in the right way, PTG should be on the forefront, but we can actually express and we can, highlight to people. Reality, though, a little bit challenging. You all know the statistics that the American churches have become some of the most homogeneous, have become one of the heterogeneous, the most diverse places, and have become more and more homogeneous in many areas. From income levels, from ethnic relation, race, and today the polarization and the grouping and the cutting out and leaving places that are uncomfortable and different from us is affecting churches at the same or even a higher rate than the rest of society. So we're not doing a great job of being places of diversity and conflict and dealing with differences, while I think there's a lot of opportunity here. Also, as a professor, it's, you have to stop talking, so now you're on. One thing before I have to do an exercise maybe or something with your neighbor, I also want to mention one other part that is, goes deep but is important to remember here. It's sometimes hard to think about the positive side of conflict because we really don't often talk about it. We don't think about it. What do you think is the amount of seconds our brain needs or kind of our brain is using to process a negative memory? How many seconds does our brain identify, process a negative memory?
1 second.
1, 3, 4, 5. 5 seconds. And that's not a bad thing. If you cross the street, it's a good idea to anticipate that something negative could happen to you, to be vigilant. If you're outside in nature, it's good to anticipate there may be wild animals. It's a survival instinct. So it's a good thing that our brain has a little bit of sense of negative things. And people, it's a medical studies, who don't anticipate have a really difficult life because it is good to be aware of the challenges. But how long does it take our brain to remember, anticipate, process a positive memory?
A nanosecond?
Nanosecond? 17 seconds. And that has gone up. 5 seconds has been kind of staying the same from what we know from research. The 17 seconds has gone up and up and up, meaning it used to be 13, 15, 17. Because I think we're kind of not surrounding ourselves, we're not sharing a lot of positive things happening to us. We're not really engaging in stories of growth, through the traumas and the challenges we have. You don't talk about, it feels like, maybe it's culturally, you don't want to brag, that something good happens to you. It does not feel, and that's why you need to also do a job of the workout that I described, the muscle. We have to train our own memory. We have to trick and train our memory. So before I let you go to do that today, for just a couple minutes, one way that our brain retention works is if we connect something that happens to us to a feeling, that we kind of remember how we felt about something. That's why sometimes negative memories are so powerful, because the sting of that is still like, when you had a fight with someone or somebody, hurt you, when you talk about it, you feel the sting of that. You feel like how that felt. And you do the same thing about something positive happens. Very often we know some good things happen to us. We kind of don't in touch with our feelings about it, how we felt, the relief, the euphoria, the happiness, and all of that. And we need to do that for our brain to remember these positive memories. So I'll let you all now talk to a neighbor and share a difficult conversation that actually turned out positive, or that you kind of were able to resolve, or to move forward, or like an engagement you had that you were not looking forward, that you were actually able to make some progress. It could be, super positive, you'd be friends after, or just, you kind of were able to resolve a challenge you had. But I want you to talk to somebody next to you and think or remember maybe the feeling you had after that conversation was over, the sense of happiness, relief, success, whatever you felt when you share that conversation with a neighbor. And then, we'll do that for 2 minutes, and then we jump to the next topic, okay? All right? All right. I know we need some more time for that, but today I want to stay on target. How hard was that to come up to think about something? I don't want to say positive, but like a difficult conversation that you actually were feeling like you made some progress in your overcoming. Was it easy to come up with examples of that? Was it hard to think about some?
No, I think there's very few in my life where that's actually worked out super well.
Yeah.
I would agree. Yeah, it was like when that moment hit, that recollection was like, oh yeah, I've got one.
Yeah. And here's what and I have the same response. So then I talked to some of my friends, so like psychologists, and I said, so here's the topic, how you deal with a lot of those challenges you have, and said, one thing, if you can get people to one thing these days, that changes everything, is get them to journal. And I started journal because I'm not a good journaler. I start journaling also about some of the positive, some of the difficult conversation I had that was overcoming. And then I figured out there was actually many more, because if you ask me that, I'm like, oh, maybe 2 or 3 I can think of. But it's a lot more, And again, if you don't make that like the topic of you talking to the worst person in your life and, making progress. If you think about the challenges, the little fights, with your partner, with your kids, the difficulties, if you kind of expand that, the little challenges we have, the church meeting, that you had to make a decision and it's not sure if, it turns out, and, the challenges, you were dealing with in travel, wherever it is, there's a lot of that in a day-to-day we're dealing with. The frustration, you're driving and somebody takes your parking spot. And if you expand it, and if you think about it, there's actually a lot more in our life than, the big ones, kind of that we always think about. And it's important to think about it, because it is part of to lean into that and saying we actually are able. Because some of the challenges, if you don't see it, it's hard to believe, when you kind of engage and get yourself worked out and worked up again to like do it again. You're like, oh man, I'm not ready. I don't know, I tried to this again, it's difficult, I don't think there's any success in that. Just remembering some successes we had is really, really key. So when I do my organization, have my team, and we're getting together, and we're dealing with conflict, so you can imagine it's a lot of work to do every day, every week. But I also start every meeting and once a week on Monday and say, look, can we stay for the first 15, 20 minutes, talk about the things we solved last week, the things we overcome, the successes we had, and not just immediately going into the meeting about, oh, here's the challenge, I need help with this, and this is what's, there's a lot of that. Also to remember some of the things that went well, or we were able to overcome, or the challenges we actually able to make some progress on. So it's part of training ourselves to making room for that. And again, you're in a faith base, in churches, we're all like dealing with, kind of, defending or fighting, to the forces all around us. And sometimes it's just good to like, oh, here's some, you had a great conversation, here's something good that happens to me. Here's other things that happen that is really difficult and different than, we think and imagine. Yes?
I was just thinking as you were talking about our expectations for the outcome.
Yeah.
Because when we go in with this preconceived idea too, and I think that's really hard to do, is how do we, and maybe you'll talk about this later, is recognizing that it may be a success, even if it's not what you had as a preconceived idea would be the outcome.
It's a major part, and like managing expectation. And sometimes people say the disappointment is actually the difference between, reality and expectation. Like if you don't set the right, manage expectations well, And that happens a lot in conflict. If you just go into a difficult conversation with a different idea what success looks like, and you don't define it, and you don't work on kind of being on the same page, then it could actually be really successful, but you feel it was not because you had a different expectation or something was not said. So yeah, there's a lot in that space. And that's a lot of the work I do. I don't have time for that, I choose to focus on something different, but I spend a lot of time in these workshops where I say the conversation about the conversation. If maybe I'd spend 5 minutes. Okay, you two started it. But it's important, like there's one thing when you have difficult conversation. We always believe that 70% of a conversation is nonverbal. I mean, that's already like what you communicate. 70% of the success or the way that you communicate is nonverbal. And we believe if it's like a difficult conversation, it's probably like 80+% is nonverbal. But when you think about a difficult conversation, what we do, we're spending all the time about what will I say, and then how will that person respond, and then how will I respond. We're playing in our head a lot about our verbal communication. With the nonverbal, how we take care, when do we plan the conversation? Is it a good time? Do we manage? Are we in an emotional stage that we're actually able to have a conversation? Or is it a time like, as a university administrator, one of my biggest mistakes was, I was the fix-it guy. I just come in and people come and they bring me problems, and then I just, immediately responded, here's what we can do in dealing with that. And I had to learn that very often, there's this, it's called the Kübler-Ross cycle of grief, that people were just in a stage of anger. They didn't want to have any solution. They want to just have a space to be heard. They just want to be angry. And they have a right for that. But I responded in a way, but I felt my job was, and there was such a disconnect of actually a very successful cathartic, conversation that they, were able to express the anger to a university administrator who actually listened. But then I blew it, but I'm like, oh, thank you for what you share. Let me fix this for you. And then it kind of felt like for them not be heard, and I felt disappointed that, and so it's like those kind of things, like are we in the same space, and what is that space? I always, when I talk to the students, I mentioned the example going home to Thanksgiving, I said, tell me when you have conversation about, in this case, politics with your family. And well, they say, well, we have a meal, there's some alcohol involved, and then it's getting late, and we eat a lot, and then we have a political conversation. So like at 9 o'clock at night, half the group is jet-lagged or drunk, and then you talk about politics. Well, let me come up with an idea that maybe that's not the moment, not to talk about it, but how about you have the same conversation the next morning with a cup of coffee, walking side by side in nature? Same conversation, same feeling, same politics. Outcome, very different in many cases, just by choosing that. So what I'm trying to say, there's a lot about the planning, the expectation, the timing that we can do, that we can influence. And if you do it well and communicate it ahead of time, it shows also care, understanding, and the other person, before they even come to the conversation, is being seen. Yeah.
Can I say something?
Yes, please.
This is very important. I had a difficult mother, and she wasn't born again, but she finally did before she died, praise God. Now, I'll tell you what happened. I used to not get along with her and could have very few conversations, but the Holy Ghost got a hold of me, and he started removing the hooks that were in there for years. So every time she would throw a hook out, it couldn't land because the Lord had taken that hook off and just went love, 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 and I saw it in the spirit. So I was able in time to speak to her and many other people because the Lord had taken the hook off of my life in many wounds, areas, and things like that. And that is a very successful communicator.
Yeah, and I think, that vulnerability of learning that, of allowing, sharing that is very powerful because people recognize there's a truth for it, there's a transformation in that. If you can do that and do it well and people listen well, it's a very powerful thing to do. So I think there's a lot of things there. Another time, maybe I should have to come back here, if you allow me to do some workshop on that. But it's a lot about that planning, that kind of, it feels very simple about time, place, manner. Is it the situation? Sometimes it's good, not to talk if you're not in the right. Sometimes it's really good And as a professional, I'll tell you not to have a conversation. It's good to not, because sometimes you can just, it's not the right moment, it's not the right time. And it's not to say not talking and kind of like, I don't want to talk to you, but like, we're not in this space yet, or I'm not in this space yet, but I want to talk. Let's figure this out and manage that. So a lot of, I think, important parts of that. But I want to kind of move us to the part of, if you engage in a difficult conversation, to think about 3 areas that I would love to leave with you today to do some work that you can do on your own. There's a book, and I don't get any money from those people, I'm just saying that as further. But the Harvard Negotiation Project, probably on the academic side, is one of the leading people who study conflict and differences. And they have this famous book, Getting to Yes, is about negotiation. But I think they have a book that's actually more powerful called Difficult Conversation, that where they unpack this idea of why are some conversations more difficult than others, and they renew it, and they talk about social media and online and face-based and all of those many elements. So I want to just share some insights from there. So those are really, really important insights, and I will add some more personal stories, but help them. When you have a difficult conversation, and here we talk about not the parking lot situation or running into somebody here we talk about a difficult conversation with somebody in your life that you're close with, where there's a history, things have happened, we're talking about a relational, like an ongoing relation with someone, or the break thereof. So this is, more of a deeper one. The key thing you have to ask yourself, and that's, I think, the main thing I want you to also take away today, some of the other stuff is, are you able, and a difficult conversation is often difficult because it's in a space of certainty. Are you able to infuse some level of curiosity in your thinking about the person, about the situation, or that the issues that you're talking about, there is some change that you can reflect? Without curiosity on your own side, it's not saying it's impossible, but we need a lot of the Holy Spirit, without curiosity, it's really difficult to move a difficult conversation further. You can be convicted, I should talk to a person because I'm a person of faith and we should talk to people, but if you don't do the work on you or in yourself to develop a level of curiosity on certain aspects, it's very hard to move things forward or to get things unstuck. So I want to talk about 3 parts where maybe there is some curiosity that you can imagine as you think about a difficult conversation or a relationship that is difficult or continues to be difficult, and see if there's something in that that kind of may be helpful to unstuck some of that. And so the book talks about there's basically 3 conversations that happens at the same time in a difficult conversation. One is kind of what happened. The agreement, disagreement about what happened in the past, what is the reality, how you look at the world, and who should be blamed for that. The second one is how what happened or the relationship makes me feel or has made me feel, and how that affected me in my feeling, or has produced or is difficult or continues to be difficult. So it really is the feeling based, and how our feelings and emotions are really one of the core elements that continue to make or contribute to the difficulties. And the last one is actually, what are some of the underlying identities, the things we believe about ourselves, sometimes recognized, sometimes not recognized, that are playing into that this conversation is maybe more difficult than others, because there are parts of us that are being questioned, are being reevaluated in this, that makes this a difficult conversation. Yes, please.
I'm sorry, but I'm wondering if this has anything to do with conversations, let's say with a group, 3 or more, and you're controversial. So you may think with confidence and articulation, you explain your situation or how you view something, not that you can't change it later, but the other person doesn't see it your way. Mm-hmm. You don't expect them to, okay? But I can believe this way, you can believe this way, and we can still be friends and not be so offended.
Yeah.
Well, why do people walk away? And some people just walk away based on what you like, what color you like.
Yeah.
Just give you an example.
Yeah.
Okay? And walk away.
Yeah. And I think, why they walk away, and that's, I think, is kind of an interesting, thank you, you're leading me into my next, so when I teach, the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, no controversy there, you know. There is not a single word, concept, whatever you write that is not being renegotiated all the time. You can read my Ph.D. and people today reinterpret any word anyway. How do you even call the area? Israel, Palestine, Israel / Palestine, whatever it is. You know, how you kind of mention any name, people around it, and people have a lot of feelings about it. So there's a lot of engaging all of that. And what I learned to come to use is to teach it in what we call a multi-narrative way. Not to say there's no truth. There is definitely truth. There's reality. But in conflict, very often narratives and the way we perceive things, as much as there's truth, is more important sometimes than the truth, because people act on what they perceive. That's not removing the truth. I'm not here to say there's no truth or right or wrong. There is certainly. But if we don't take people seriously or not take them where their perception is, we're going to miss out on the opportunity to take them seriously, to really reevaluate where they're coming from and to see if there's any movement in any direction. So the truth assumption, what it's called, it's not to say there's no truth, it's just like to renegotiate and saying people may have multiple truths and there can be truth to them. That is just important to take into effect. And if you change a conversation saying, if we don't agree on my truth, we cannot have a conversation, that certainty versus curiosity, it's really difficult to move past that. That doesn't mean that we have to give up on our truth, not at all. We can believe, we can be right in that, but I think we have to think about how we present it and how much curiosity we can engage into allowing somebody else to be listening to. The second part, which is also really, kind of speaking to your point, it's called what we call the intention invention. Very often when you think about a difficult conversation, something happens to you. Somebody said something happened to you, and it had an impact. And what people try to say to make a difference between, or question, or put curiosity in the game of impact and intention. So something happened to me, and the question was that intentional? Did that person really, were they planning to hurt me that way? Or was the impact it had on me, was that intentional? Or do I know that my intention, what impact it had on the other person? And very often we collide those two. Something happens, I'd be really affected by it, something terrible, and it really has really terrible consequences in life. And we immediately, in the way of blaming or in the way of justifying that this other person is wrong or I'm right, we attach that this was intentional. The other person intended that impact to happen. And so again, the question is to introduce what we say a little bit of curiosity. Have we ever engaged with the person group that we're dealing with and have ever reflected on that what happened to me or happened to them that was impacted or intended that way? And I'm not saying it wasn't. Some people said, I wanted to hurt you, and it did. I'm not trying to be like in the real world. Some people want to be hurt and being hurt, being hurtful, and it happened. But very often people say, I want to speak my truth. I did not intended that it had that impact on you, or I didn't know it had that impact on you because we never ask. So the question of intact and intention. And then the last one, the blame frame. When you kind of stay in a space of right or wrong, who is to blame for the whole thing, it also does not allow you to interject curiosity. When you look at that, it's like, yes, I can be open, but in the end, they were wrong and I'm right, or like they're to blame for it. It does just move you still on a hierarchy, in a conversation, a difficult conversation of like, they're to be blamed for no matter what. And to reflect on that and to be curious and to removing the idea of who is to be blaming for it, to be blamed for it, or to like, kind of diminish is important, because very often that's the way to get out of that, like I don't want to talk to my mom anymore because, she was wrong and this is how it is. Or they did this, they're to be blamed for it. So reflecting on, more narrative perspective, impact, intention, and trying to, can we renegotiate this, who is to be blamed for it, is kind of a suggestion to interject curiosity. And to see if you think about that person, the conversation, is there any of that you maybe haven't really asked or don't know, or there may be something that you may be curious about. The second part is the feeling. There's a lot to talk about feelings, and feelings are reality, and dealing also with feelings. Feelings are also part of the way we assert ourselves. I always use the example. I travel a lot with American and international students or European students, and I go to conflict zones, and we're learning about conflicts. That's the work I do. I bring students and other groups into conflict and post-conflict environments to learn about these issues. And then we do this daily, what we call reflection. So we're sitting like this, in a circle with like 20, 30 students from different campuses. And then people share like what they saw. We have speakers, and often the American students would open up their sharing with, I feel. Quote unquote code, do not touch this. This is my feeling, this is my truth. Nobody can question this. And then more than not, like another student says, thank you for your feelings. Not in a nice way, I don't care, thanks for your feelings, but what has it to do with like, the things we discuss, So people just have different ideas also of feelings. And I want to just mention that feelings, they're true and they're important, but they're also manipulated, also being used in the way we communicate and difficult conversation happens. But what feelings often, what we don't do is that we have feelings and we're not really good in communicating where they originate from. Meaning that sometimes we don't even know, we just feel it, but we haven't really reflected on why, We just like, I feel angry, but I haven't really reflected on why do I feel angry? It's like kind of like, where does that anger come from? Does it come, that I feel like hostility? Does it come that I'm just annoyed? Does it come from like, I'm jealous? Can contempt? A feeling can have very different originating ideas. Or there's another person who expresses very strong feelings, and they express them but in a simplified, more language way. I don't really know where that comes from. And so the idea, again, to interject curiosity when we reflect feelings, or that people are very, very, very emotional, or that we have a strong sense of emotion about a situation or an issue, is to, what I like that, that phrasing, is to expand our emotional footprint, to try to be more detailed in communicating our own feelings about an issue, about what happened, in the way we think about things, and to solicit a more deeper understanding of other people's emotion in the way they respond or they're part of that conversation as a group or as an individual. So that feelings are not just like, I'm angry, deal with it, or like, or I don't care, versus like, let me more share where that anger comes from. Then we can actually address it, or we can actually talk more about the details, or where my sense of love or my sense of sadness comes from, how I respond to them. So using or expanding our emotional footprint, I think, is really key. And then as the not last but not least is also to really reflect on identity about a difficult conversation. Why is it that, sometimes these things, I feel attacked in that? And we often think about identity in the basic kind of like religious identity or ethnic identity and all of it. The identity politics are all over the place. But I think sometimes we're only looking at identity as kind of a surface level, and not looking at identity as more of a deeper sense. Like when I come into a space and somebody attack me about what I say and all of that, there's a lot of like, well, like I have to like really unpack how I feel about it. Has it to do that I feel like my competency is being questioned? I'm here as the professor, as the expert, and you coming and telling me I'm wrong, or you kind of criticizing me. How much of my response has it to do that I have a certain identity that I believe about myself, and that I'm kind of dealing, with that? And there's a whole study in, university we call about this imposter syndrome, when people like feel like have a lot of insecurities about should they be there, or should they even be able to have an expertise in any of that, and then people question it, it goes much deeper. So it may be not anything to do with what's being said, it just has a lot to do about where I am in my insecurity. I find that one a really hard one, I'm a good person in difficult conversation, like I'm a Christian, I'm a good person, I'm a peacemaker, I couldn't hurt, I didn't want to hurt, it was never my intention. Well, I still do. I might be a good person, or I might believe I'm a good person, but I still are able to do terrible things or cause things that are not good. And I have to come to face that. And then somebody attacks me and saying how sometimes impacted them, even though it was not my intention, the resistance is like, I'm a good person. I cannot acknowledge that because that sounds so terrible. I wouldn't be that person. A lot of things right now is, I'm a victim, like I've been victimized, I'm a victim in something, and being a victim is hard to be victimizing anybody else. In my work, that's a lot of a challenge, where a lot of people leaning into their story of, and the terrible things that happen to them, and it's really hard to acknowledge that also you can victimize others, or vice versa, that when something happened to you, that this does not just play into that same core wound, that you have as a victim, that the other person may or may not know or has not any idea or understanding from, but actually just hit on that. And then the last one, which is really an interesting one, and that's something I discuss a lot with people, am I worthy of love? Difficult conversation. Again, if you don't have this muscle being trained, and we're living in a society also that is also actually the big void of love, of people being loved, feeling seen, understood, and then you have a conflict or difficult conversation, that goes deep. I'm like, I'm not lovable, I'm not worthy of love, and that just can have immediately consequence of shutting down that may have nothing to do with the topic or the disagreement, but just with the core wound of feeling not worthy. So it's important to reflect on this identity, and here I always have to mention some of the other things you can reflect on. You can do the journaling, reflecting on doing that. Sometimes when you kind of go deep on identity question, things come up where it's really important to share with others and ask for help. And I had to do it myself. Sometimes when I had to reflect on some of the deeper identity issues, things surfaced that I did not expect, where we needed professional help to unpack them. So when you do that, they can show up. It might be like, reflecting or have that. Some issues come up that you're like, wow, there's something much deeper here. So it's important to also acknowledge that this is not a process you have to do on your own or shouldn't do on your own, and be involved in. But these are just some ideas. I'm throwing them at you. Not to say that they have been or are part of the difficulties or difficult conversation that you're part of, but they might be resonating with you in some other ways, or at least get you to a point of asking question. So again, still in time, very German of me. But identity is important because identity, I find, is such a big topic, and I love talking about it because I think it is affecting people so much. So I want to do a little exercise with you for yourself. So did you all pick up this little paper here, if you have it? Does anybody have a pen? I don't know. Oh, there are pens too there. Okay, all right.
If anyone needs a pen, just take it and pass it around.
Oh, perfect. All right. I just do this as an exercise. So to reflect on identity, because the challenge with identity is that it's such a big topic, and that we all talk about it, but we kind of very often talk past each other, and we also have a lot of assumption about identity that hopefully this exercise will highlight a little bit. So this is just for yourself. There's nothing to be right or wrong. This is for you personally. But I think it is not a surprise to say that identity is what we call multi-hyphenated issue, that we all have multiple identity to ourselves. So I asked you at this moment right now, if you could mention in this first 6 boxes, 6 parts of your very complex identity that you find right now are the most important, pertinent, the ones that are showing up to yourself. That could be your faith, it could be your gender, it could be your work, it could be your relationship, whatever it is. Identity can be so broad. But what are 6 parts of your very complex identity that are right now, in this moment, are showing up as the most prevalent, expressive, strongest that you can right now write down? And some people would make a difference between their work life and their professional life and their private life, so you can choose one of them, and that doesn't matter, but very many of us show up differently in our work professional environment as we show up in our personal environment, as kind of from an identity perspective. But just write in 6 things in these boxes. Some people have immediately 15 and have to cut it down already. Other people are struggling to find 6. Again, that doesn't matter. It's just the sense of acknowledging some of the various parts of our identity that are there. Okay. If you would have to pick 2 out of those 6 that are a little bit stronger or more pertinent or matter to you right now, that's just for you personally, 2 that are kind of more expressive right now, which would those be? So it's a sense of elimination. Just pick out of the 6, 2, and put them in the next 2 boxes. What I like out of your complex identity, what are the 2 things that right now, in this moment, are the more stronger, showing up, pertinent to you? And that's not a judgment. That's not the most important part, but they're the ones that are showing up to you right now in the strongest way. All right. You don't need a PhD to know what comes next. So if I have to ask you to cut down that to one, just choose one of, which is it in that? And again, there's no wrong, there's no right. It's just for you. But here's the question I would like to ask you. Do you believe that people, let's say in your professional environment as well as your personal environment, know, or that this part of your identity right now is the most important part to you? Again, there's no right or wrong, just a check-in. Do you think people in your, in the world, the people you deal with, personal life, professional life, have a sense that this is the thing right now, part of your identity that matters the most? So I've done this exercise with so many people, faith leaders, like heads of churches, heads of congregations, all of that. And sometimes it's interesting, it's not a judgment. Faith may not even show up at the 6 parts. Or they're like leadership, whatever it is, because you kind of in a different situation, As I mentioned, I just became a father last December, so my metric is just completely shifting, like what I thought about myself, what was important to me, it's a whole thing. What I'm trying to say is that identity, we talk about it as a fixated certain thing, in particular in conflict. Because when you deal with somebody, you put them in a box from an identity perspective. They're showing up as this strong leader, or they show up in their positionality, or they show up in their ignorance, or they're showing up in their expression of their faith, or they're showing, we kind of make people or bring them down to a very simplified certain way in their identity in a difficult conversation, in a conflict. While we acknowledge to ourselves that we are much more complex and that we are changing and shifting all the time, or things that matter to us is different at different times. So what I'm trying to do is just interject another kind of sense of curiosity, because identity is often used as a way to shut things down. Identity is often used as a way of there's a certainty that cannot be removed. I can be curious, but that person is who they are and they're not going to change. And I think if we're honest to ourselves, we are changing all the time. And sometimes the same conversation at a different parts, a different time, in a different context can have a very different outcome because we are in a different space. And we have moved and we have shifted and we have kind of not being fixated to all of that. So again, being curious also about identity vis-a-vis you, vis-a-vis the other person or the group is also another person to do. Another way to potentially interjecting curiosity into a complex thing. All right, and how do we make all sense in all of that? And I'll just leave you that. So if you just want to put some of the things we just talked about into kind of a verbal way as a conversation come up. These are just some conversation or sentences vis-a-vis the 3 conversation. When you say, instead of entering the space of I know what truth is, to say, let me share the way I experience what happened. Let me kind of tell you my version of the thing, the truth, the whatever it is. And then let me share or ask what impact it had, or what I intended, the difference between impact and intention. And then, ownership. This is what, when I reflected on what, here's some, who was it, the vulnerability, Here's some things I can take ownership about, that people's that you can open a space that they're also here's something I can maybe own. I still believe what I believe, but I could have said it more nicely, or I could have said it in a different way. There's a lot of things we can move around that. Or about feelings or identity. These are just verbal ways to interject them. But they're kind of ways to open up that space from certainty to curiosity. And obviously, a conversation has 2 parts to it. You can do the work. Again, managing expectation, it was brought up, very important, that just because you did the work doesn't mean the other person has, So may give them some time or not expect that they immediately respond in kind. You had so much time to think about it, reflect about it, and they may not. To also respond in that way or give them time to do it. But more often than not, if we do this thoughtfully, if we come to a place of people saying, look, I reflected on where we are, I want to just ask a little bit more question, or I did some thinking about what happened, I want to share some of my thinking and solicit some of that, we can open a start of a conversation and move more into more curious space that may shift things. I'm not saying solve things or make things right, you may agree to disagree, but the relationship may be restored or may be put in a different place than it has been for many of us that are being faced with not being talking to people or not being enjoying being around them. All right, 3 minutes over, but a lot to share, and that's just like a little tidbit of a lot of things to do. And I wanted just to give 2 minutes. I left a little bit of a sign-up sheet for what the work I do besides giving seminars and all of that is, as I mentioned, is bringing people into a journey. The longer I do this, the longer I was a professor, and I mean it in the most nicest way, I felt the power we have to speak into people's life just by being a professor became smaller and smaller. I think, my students these days, for many good reasons, don't believe anything anymore they hear, they read. There's just everything is not just fake news, everything has an angle, including what the professor has to say. And I felt that, however, experiences are at an all-time high. And I have my critique to that, that people experiences, and I unfortunately also feel that the polarizing force in our society doing an excellent job to create and recreate experiences to get stuck into the mind, in the worldview that people are in. And that people like myself, who are educators, are not doing a good job to help people or lead them through experiences that can interject curiosity about their own beliefs in the world now and then. And so my own work is, if there's one space that interjects a lot of curiosity and complexity, it is conflicts. So I do travel to the Middle East, before recently, but Northern Ireland, Vietnam and Cambodia. I do a trip to Germany and France about their historic reconciliation. I'm doing a lot of work in Bosnia, wherever it is, and take groups there to meet with people, to learn about the context of their conflict and healing and reconciliation or challenges, to solicit curiosity and conversation among the people I take with about their own lives and challenges in societies. So that's the main job I do, a lot on the road, a lot of travel. So if you're interested in that, there's also trips that are open to any community members, including yourself. I'm just doing this trip to France and Germany. That's a community trip, that's not just students. There are opportunities for that, and if you want to, you can sign up our newsletter. We're not spamming, we should do a better job in advertising, but can let you know about some of these opportunities. But that's the context I moved away, give up my nice, cushy UC job, into a much more challenging, non-profit environment, but I'm too much of a activist at heart, I believe, to do that. So, but yeah, that's what I do, but I'm happy to open it up to a conversation about this and other things, and would love to, yes.
Can you just give us a couple of sentences on the French-German?
Okay.
Do you call it a reconciliation or something else?
Yeah, so French, I'm German, so I'll give you just a personal context. So my grandfather never would set foot into France. 300 years of those two countries trying to erase each other. I mean, literally trying to kill each other. He was really afraid, till the end of his life, was really afraid of French. French was the first language I learned. Every German city has a French partner city. I cannot imagine emotionally, physically, intellectually, having any conflictual feelings towards a person coming from France. It's just, Europe, and we're now building that. So it's like, how do we get there? Like, obviously, there's a history of World War I, and there was a winner and loser, and there's a whole reflection on that. But how do we, on a personal civil society, get to this point of two countries that were sworn enemies with a history of destroying each other and very much blood being spilled in this effort, to becoming more the motor of Europe? And what are some mechanisms that were employed from the top down, the state, ideas, as well as the civil society? So that's the trip is about, to reflect on that. Is that hopefully? Oh, yeah, okay, yeah. So that's part, which is a lot to do. Yes, sorry.
It just so happens that I lived in Germany during the Cold War for 3 years. I had to spell Coptic. He was a little bit German, mostly Norwegian descent, but we were there to the airport. And my husband used to go to Cologne, not to go there, actually. He would go a lot because he spoke German. He worked as a medical school. So there was a lot of conflict in talking about France and Germany. So we were there, and it was exciting, and everything, but it was eventually resolved. But there are two psychologists that came in my memory, and I want to know what you think about now. Carl Jung, Swiss, I believe, and Maslow. Maslow. They were sort of about the person's self-actualization. And at that time, it was kind of a thing of those from the past that was used, utilized. So I've been around difficult situations. I've lived it. And my father came from South America, from a country named after Christopher Columbus.
Yeah.
There's a thing here where we celebrate Indigenous Day. So with the conflict, there's a lot of Italians and people who respect Christopher Columbus. So what do you think of Maslow today?
Yeah, I mean, there's another whole talk. Jung obviously is a whole, and I think Carl Jung, I think is a lot of things. I mean, he was obviously a father, a lot of psychological thinking, and there's a lot of, I think, reflection on his contribution. The same with Maslow. Maslow, which in my world, I'm a trained political scientist. The pyramids of needs. Like when people have the ability to even engage in kind of, conflict resolution. Traditional. We look at more of a. It feels like kind of that comes after all the other needs are done. That's the traditional thinking, Like if you don't know what to eat and where to live and all the security that you experience, like you don't have time to think about making peace, like you're just survivalist. And so I think we're kind of renegotiating a little bit of that, like what is actually the pyramids of needs and do we really have, like how these things also belong together and people having more of a sense of belonging, while being still not feeling that all the material needs are being taken care of does also help versus not. So there's a lot of kind of questioning doing that. I mean, important work, so can give you my thoughts on that, but they definitely, I think, highlight ideas of when it comes to conflict resolution, what's possible and what the sequencing of it is, what comes first and what comes not. So there's a lot, work we do that, Can talk to you more about that, but thanks for bringing that up. But any other question that you have, Oliver? Yeah.
I have two friends who have a living situations really negative and different ages, and they'll have conflicts, things that happen.
Yeah.
Different stories from each side. And I said this week, the two of them having a conversation is almost doesn't matter because they're just going to talk about what this is exactly, different variations of it, but it's well established there's a conflict. I can tell you from what there's zero curiosity on either part. So this is, maybe I can somehow inject this in this, but in that situation, like all of us here, we're open to it, obviously. What's your suggestion for people that might be like this?
Again, I'm not, I live in the real world, and curiosity is also muscle that you have to start with. So I think it's a conversation. A lot of peace building or conflict resolution, you talk about shuttle diplomacy, so that would be you. So when people like putting them in a room with that animosity, and it's just like it's not a good, but you maybe just go through this and saying, oh, as church, I lived this thing, here's some of the things we talked about. Is there anything in there that you can imagine? Is there anything that you have curiosity towards? And then they may talk to you, and then you may got to that person saying, actually, I'm not telling you what they say because it's confidential, but they were reflecting on some of those things. Is there anything, You can also solicit curiosity as a third party and see if there's space. And very often as in the big world, peace building between nations and all of that, that's the work that the third parties, if they do a good job, do often, kind of like feeling like, when we talk ripeness is a kind of a concept. Is there a ripeness for even having that negotiation conflict, or are we still in the space of trying to believe that we could kill each other, that's the best solution, or is there a certain, kind of exaggerated, people I'm just tired, I just want to go on with life, what that means. And obviously we're living in the real world. Some people are not ready for it, but I also want to be clear that when I thought people would never change, I've seen a lot of change in my life that I've never thought was possible. And so I train myself of not being ignorant or of not being too optimistic, but also being open that things can change, And I've been surprised. And when you talk about conflicts, again, what people believe is never possible. And in the world of conflict resolution, the things we use all these big words, never, forever. We talk about intractable conflict, basically meaning never to be solvable conflict. And then things change quickly. And my personal story as a German, as somebody now in his 40s, going to the Middle East, what that meant, and a lot of personal experiences that blew me away of something that I thought was never be possible. And people probably would have thought is not possible. A lot of transformation. I think the human spirit, and I think we're living in a spiritual world of miracles. My father-in-law is a philosopher, actually wrote how miracles are proving miracles. There are things that are possible. We kind of things happen all the time that I think we are not ready for. But also I think we have to be realistic, not to build on divine intervention all the time without doing our work. I mean, God has given us a brain and ability to learn and to do the best we can. And then we obviously need his intervention, to many of those works where we're at, so.
What can we do as a church community to kind of foster that curiosity and that connection that Jake's
I think, start with yourself and just figure out, are there spaces or issues that you as particular this church or as a community you feeling you're facing, It could be, just putting these things out there. Because I'm recently, worked with a church in Orange County, St. Mark's Presbyterian Church, actually there. I did a program around the border, taking groups to Mexico-US border and meeting people and immigrants and vice versa and people being affected by it, This was a big topic in the church there around what do we think about immigration and how we feel about emotionally, how we think as a church, how we think about what is our job, politically and all of that. And to do that, are there spaces, I live in LA, around homelessness, there are other issues, is there a sense of curiosity that you can foster and then engage in a systematic way as a church to learn, to meet, to hear different perspective, and you have enough of people who want to engage in that. And I think the beautiful thing is when you interject curiosity in things in some parts in your life, it kind of is a beautiful thing that grows in other parts. So I think but it's very experiential. It's not something, in my humble opinion, that you can solve intellectually. I think it's something to go out and experience and be willing to quote unquote fail, to have a good intention and things may not be perceived as well or difficult in that. That's what I think you can do. And I think churches are actually so beautiful and powerful, but I think we also have put ourselves in a space where we felt like we tried it or we feel like we're not being seen or heard or irrelevant or people don't, Look, I was a professor at the University of California, and a person of faith, and I had a lot of beliefs that people thought about it, and I had a lot of interesting conversation about it. Like what it means and where it comes from. And obviously I played the European card, I'm not one of those people here, and I got out of it, but there was a lot more curiosity than I would have assumed, coming in with a defensive stance about academia is very anti-faith or anti. So.
Well, on behalf of the Presbyterian Church, Daniel, thank you so much for being here with us today. Don't forget the sign-up sheet is over here if you want to learn more about Daniel's work, and he also has some cards if you'd like to reach out and look.
Sure, absolutely.
So thank you again.
But I'm not traveling, I'm around.